Ohio State just won the 2025 CFP National Championship. And while the playoff clearly showed that they're the best team in the country, would they have even been in the playoff in any other year? Obviously, the rankings were done differently this year, but the Buckeyes finished as the 6th ranked team in the final regular season rankings. And after the stupid reseeding for the conference champions was done, they ended up as the 8th seed and the final team to clinch a home playoff game. They then went on an incredible playoff run in which they beat 4 straight top 10 teams by 10 plus points in one of, if not the most impressive things that a college football team has ever done to finish a season. So I don't really know where to stand on this because on one hand, including more teams in the playoff allowed for underdogs to make great runs and play great games they otherwise would not have been able to in a smaller playoff. But I don't really know how Ohio State is an underdog with that roster. I mean, before the season, they were calling it the best Ohio State roster of all time, and maybe it was. But that's kind of leads into my next point. Teams that failed in big games at the end of the season and in conference championship games were rewarded with a second chance that didn't exist in college football prior to this year. That's part of what I said I was worried about with this format. With more playoff spots, there's greater room for error, which allows for a devaluing of games on any given Sunday. And it turns out that not only does it devalue games on any given Sunday, but an upset, a massive upset in a rivalry game on the last week of the season means nothing. And it's not just any rivalry. It's Michigan, Ohio State, maybe the biggest rivalry in the country. Oh my God! And don't forget that after Ohio State lost to Michigan for the 4th straight time, this year at home, everyone was calling for Ryan Day to get fired. And again, in any other year, he probably would have ended up being fired. So to test this theory of mine, let's look at what might have happened at the end of this season if the 12-team playoff didn't exist. So if this season was a 14 playoff, then Oregon is the number 1 seed. They're a 13-0 Big Ten champ with 3 top 10 wins, and any season they would be the number 1 team. They'd be the number 1 seed. They would be the number 1 seed in BCS. They'd be the number 1 seed in a 4-team, a 12-team playoff, a 65-team playoff. They just turned college football into March Madness. But in the one playoff game they played, they fucking choked. They sucked a big one. But what can you do about that? Georgia is a more interesting case because in the now 11 years of the CFP, the SEC is the only power conference to never have a conference champion on the outside looking in. So even before automatic bids, an SEC champion was a stamped ticket to the semifinal. On the other hand, there was never a 2-loss team that made the 4-team field. So while it's super unlikely that we would get all this conference realignment and in turn all these crazy conference schedules without the 12-team playoff, let's just say that everything played out in the same way, but instead of a 12-team, we had the 4-team playoff like we had before. Then, with the precedent that no 2-loss team had ever made the field, teams like Oregon, Notre Dame, Indiana, Boise State, and Army would be the ones in consideration for the 4-team field. And I don't think that's exactly what we would get, but I do think that all the 1-loss teams would have been ranked higher than they were in this year's rankings. Me, I'm unprecedented, and I'm monetized, so make sure you like and subscribe and continue on the journey, because soon enough I'm going to quit my job and fucking ride the wave. It's kind of the start of this interesting thought experiment, because of these teams, even without the hindsight of how the playoffs shook out, Notre Dame seems like a spot-on 4-team playoff participant, right? Based on what we had in years past, Notre Dame would definitely have been in the 4-team field. The Northern Illinois loss would be a black eye, but the way they played the rest of the season, how they beat teams, their schedule, even though there was no real top 25 games when it came to the end of the season, they beat a lot of teams that were ranked when they played them. So that, along with what is probably one of the more important things that the CFP doesn't talk about, the amount of viewers that Notre Dame would bring into those games, they're definitely in either the 2 or the 3 spot in a 4-team field. Now, Georgia as a 2-loss SEC champ, I think would be higher than both Indiana and Boise State. But I do think that Boise State would be ranked higher than Indiana because they're a conference champ and they did better in their one big game. Both of these teams kind of had one big game, and Boise State did better than Indiana did in their one big game. So let's just kind of order them out from the 5 teams we've talked about so far. We've got Oregon at 1, then Notre Dame, Georgia, Boise State, and Indiana as the 5 teams we've ranked. So then let's add in what I think are the two most interesting teams in this thought experiment in the 4-team scenario. That's Texas and Penn State. So these guys are also one-loss regular season teams, but they have a loss in their conference championship as well. And I don't want to base this conversation off of what the committee said about a conference championship loss this season, because really there is no info on that. We'll talk about that a little later, but they didn't give us anything about what a conference championship loss actually means. I just want to base it on historical data, since we are looking at a historical scenario. Only Georgia in 2021 and TCU in 2022 lost in a conference championship game and still made the CFP in that same year. But both of those teams came into their conference championship game as undefeated teams, so they left with only one loss. And obviously both Texas and Penn State will be coming in with a loss and become 2-loss teams because of that conference championship loss. So when it comes to comparison to Georgia, obviously Texas will be ranked behind them because they lost to Georgia not once, but twice before the playoff rankings. But Penn State versus Georgia actually is a little bit more interesting, because on one hand, Penn State's only losses were to 2 top 10 teams by an average of 7.5 points. And one of those losses was in the conference championship game. But their best win was against a fringe top 25 Illinois team at home in September. And they struggled in multiple road games at USC, at Minnesota, against 2 teams that were both barely bowl eligible. And then on the other hand, you've got Georgia, who did have 2 losses, both outside of the top 10, but they were to top 15 teams on the road, and they have 3 top 10 wins, including 2 against Texas, in addition to being the SEC conference champ. So it definitely does still mean something to be a conference champion in any playoff conversation. So it's definitely Georgia that wins out in that conversation as the best 2-loss team, and probably the 3 seed, maybe the 2 seed, but either way, one semifinal matchup is set. It's Notre Dame versus Georgia. But the conversation around the final playoff spot is crazy. And when you look at it versus the argument that they would have in a season where they actually had 4 teams, you can see the havoc that conference realignment has brought to the sport. The ACC champ would not be in the conversation. The Pac-12 champ, well, you know. What about the Big 12 champ? For context, there has been 6 years where multiple Power 5 conference champions have been left out of the 4-team playoff field. But only in one of those years has a team with a comparable record and a conference championship been on the outside looking in. That was 2018, when Ohio State was 12-1, but ranked number 6 in the final CFP poll, while Big 12 champ Oklahoma, who was also 12-1, got the 4th and final playoff spot. Now this year, Arizona State had the same 11-2 record as SEC champ Georgia had coming out of the conference championship week. They also had 2 top 25 wins, both of which came in the final month of the regular season. Only Oregon, Georgia, and Alabama had more top 25 wins, and only Ohio State and Ole Miss can even match that mark through the regular season. But they also had 2 losses to teams outside of the top 25, and only Notre Dame, Clemson, and Tennessee even had 1 amongst the 12 playoff teams. So let's make sense of what we're looking at before we start to consider the positioning of the national champs. We have Oregon 1, and I'm going to say Notre Dame 2 and Georgia 3, both because of the record and because of the injury to Beck. I mean, look at what they did to FSU last year. So that leaves us with Texas, Penn State, Boise State, Arizona State, Indiana, Ohio State, and I'll slip in Tennessee there for consideration for that 4th spot. Now, let's get rid of some teams, right? Tennessee had the win against Alabama, which is one of the better wins in the country, but the loss to Arkansas combined with the loss of Georgia definitely puts them behind Texas for sure, so that's enough to take them out of the conversation. Indiana, remarkably, as a 1-loss Big Ten team, has no real win to hang their hat on and kind of got whipped by Ohio State, so let's take them out too. And then Boise State is probably in about the same boat as Indiana, right? G5 conference champ, but just a couple wins against UNLV and a close loss to Oregon doesn't do enough to jump over Texas or Penn State, so we're going to take them out too. So that leaves us with 4 teams to consider. Penn State and Arizona State, which we've talked about, and Texas and Ohio State, which we haven't yet touched on. Texas, at first glance, would be the obvious choice here. They're the SEC runner-up, whose only losses are to the SEC champion twice, and they have a big non-conference road win at Michigan in the Big House. But weirdly, when you look closer at the resume, they do have the easiest SEC schedule, and none of the teams that they beat stayed in the top 25 through the regular season. So how do you end up comparing that to Penn State and Arizona State? Both of those teams have top 25 wins. The Sun Devils actually have 2, and Penn State's losses are very comparable to Texas's. So instead of comparing all those teams together, let's just clump them in one clump that's called the 13-game, 2-loss teams behind Georgia. And the tiebreaker will be comparing each team to Ohio State and seeing how it pans out. Starting with Arizona State. The Sun Devils have a Power 4 conference championship, although in the weakest of the power conferences. And they came in as the hottest team in the country with those 2 top 25 wins to end the season. Ohio State, on the other hand, had the worst loss of any team at the end of the season, not only because Michigan needed that win to finish the season above 500, but because Ohio State could have won and gone into the Big Ten championship and potentially ended with the number 1 seed in the country without that loss. But even so, that Michigan loss was better than both of Arizona State's losses, and Ohio State has 2 top 10 victories, which are both better than Arizona State's best win. So, advantage, Ohio State. Now, Penn State, and this comparison to Ohio State is probably the easiest, right? Ohio State beat Penn State at Beaver Stadium in what was by far the biggest regular season game outside of the conference championship game for Penn State. And they wouldn't have even had a chance to be in that conference championship game if Ohio State didn't stub their toe at the end of the season against the Wolverines. And as much as in my heart I want to punish Ohio State for that loss, the win against Indiana being better than any of Penn State's wins, in addition to Penn State losing to Ohio State, the advantage has to go to Ohio State here as well. That leaves us with Texas. And we know the resumes here, so I want to do something a little bit different. Instead, I want to look at the rankings from week 14, the second to last week of the season, and look at what the committee was thinking before Texas had its best regular season win and before Ohio State had its worst loss of the season. Week 14, Ohio State was number 2 and Texas was number 3. Both teams ahead of Notre Dame and Georgia, who have already cemented their spot in our 14 playoff. But what about after that final week of the regular season, right before conference championship week? Texas stepped up to 2 after their survive win against Texas A&M, while Ohio State dropped to 6 after scoring 10 points in their home loss to Michigan. And I know I'm kind of beating down this Michigan loss, but it's kind of the whole point of my video here, right? Personally, I think Ohio State's 6 ranking was strategic to get them out of the way of the conference championship game participants so the committee wouldn't have to set too much of a precedent what a conference championship game loss means in the era of the 12 team. And I think the loss kind of took some weight off of the committee because if Ohio State does win and makes the Big Ten championship game and wins, what do you do with Oregon, Penn State, and Texas all kind of clumped up there? With all that said, we're going to take out the Week 15 rankings because this video is about the rankings changing for the 12-team playoff, and this is where we can really start to see that kick in. So let's just work off of the Week 14 rankings and compare resumes going forward. Ohio State goes 0-1 with an unranked home loss, and Texas goes 1-1. Well, the win was a road win against a team that spent 10 weeks of the season ranked, but had a rough ending and didn't end the season ranked. The loss was an overtime loss in their conference championship game against the team that we had number 3 in our rankings. That definitely favors Texas, but the question is, how big of a gap was there between 2 and 3 in the Week 14 rankings? So I guess we will kind of compare resumes, right? Ohio State has 2 top 10 victories against teams that stayed in the top 10. None of the teams that Texas beat stayed in the top 25 through the end of the season. And Ohio State's loss to Oregon is slightly better than Texas's home loss in the regular season to Georgia. But Ohio State does have an additional regular season loss. And don't forget, Texas beat Michigan at the Big House by almost 20 points in September. And I think that point right there would be the most damning evidence that the committee would point to say Texas has earned the number 4 seed over Ohio State and will be in the playoff. Now, obviously, Ohio State is the better team. I mean, they beat Texas in the semifinal. They're the best team in the country, and they probably have been the entire season. If you give them even one more second, they make it out of Eugene alive. And then the Michigan loss doesn't even matter, because that's definitely a whole different thing. But what happened in the regular season did happen. And as I just showed, the new format changed the regular season. It changed what's important in the regular season and made it so a team that would not have been in the 14 playoff could win the national championship this season. And of course, that's obvious, right? I mean, that's part of the reason that we have the expansion in the first place. But it is important to go through and look at how the CFP committee has changed how they look at the regular season in the era of the 12-team playoff. In reality, what would have been a gut-wrenching, season-ending, job-ending loss for Ohio State and Ryan Day didn't really cost them all that much. It might have actually helped them by getting them a home playoff game instead of otherwise having to play 4 straight neutral site games had they won the Big Ten championship. And I could go on and on about changes that need to come to the playoff format, but that will be ironed out over the years. What I will say is that the change in the regular season from the BCS to the 4-team playoff pales in comparison to the change that we saw from last year to this year. Not only the conference realignment and the crazy conference schedules, which I said would not have happened without the 12-team playoff, but what a win and what a loss means has been redefined. What is valued when it comes to rankings has changed dramatically. And while there were worries that teams would schedule light and stay away from scheduling big games, I think if you look at what happened, the opposite should be true. The committee has made clear that big-time wins and showing what the team can do at their peak is much more valuable than stub-your-toe losses. Ohio State played in 3 top 10 matchups during the regular season, more than any team outside of conference championship games. And they used that experience to go on an incredible playoff run. I think teams and conferences will learn from this, and we will see many more big-time regular season games in the coming years. Everything is changing in college football, and that's for better or for worse. Thanks for watching that video. Make sure you like, subscribe, and if you made it this far, leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. If you want to watch more of my videos, you can go over here. We got my most recent video, which is about a potential Big Ten SEC merger. Up here, I've got my most popular video, which is about the SEC and conference realignment. Other than that, I got my subscribe link over there, and we'll catch you next time. See ya!